Kate Morrison had not slept properly in 6 months, and this flight was supposed to fix that problem. She sat in seat 23A on the commercial airplane heading from Hawaii to Los Angeles, with her eyes closed and her body finally relaxed after 18 months of military service on a carrier ship in the Pacific Ocean. The engines hummed quietly and she felt herself drifting into the first real sleep she had experienced in what felt like years. Her hoodie was pulled over her head and she had pushed the seat back as far as it would go in the cramped coach section. Other passengers around her were watching movies or reading books or talking quietly, but Kate heard none of it because she was already half asleep when the announcement came through the speakers. The captain's voice was too controlled and too calm in that specific way that meant something was seriously wrong. Kate had heard that tone before in combat situations and her eyes opened immediately, even though her brain was still foggy with exhaustion. The captain said he needed to know if there was a fighter pilot on board, and he needed to know right away. Kate listened as passengers around her started whispering and looking at each other with confused expressions on their faces. A flight attendant walked quickly down the aisle, and Kate could see the tension in her shoulders even though she was smiling at passengers who asked her questions. Kate reached up and pressed the call button above her seat. The flight attendant arrived within seconds, and Kate told her quietly that she was a fighter pilot and currently serving as a lieutenant commander in the Navy. The woman's face showed relief immediately, and she asked Kate to follow her to the cockpit right away. Kate stood up and grabbed her small bag from under the seat and followed the attendant through the narrow aisle, while other passengers stared at her with worried expressions. She was still wearing old jeans and a college sweatshirt that had coffee stains on the front, and she probably looked more like a tired student than a military officer. The cockpit door opened and Kate stepped inside to find two men who both looked stressed and tired. Captain Phillips was older with gray hair and lines around his eyes, and the co-pilot was younger with the name Harris on his uniform. Phillips turned to look at Kate and she saw genuine relief in his face when he asked if she was current on her training. Kate told him she had just finished 18 months flying F-35C jets from a carrier and asked what was happening. Harris pointed to the radio equipment and explained that NORAD had contacted them because something was in orbit above Earth, and it was not human technology. Kate felt her stomach tighten as Harris continued, explaining that fighter jets had been scrambled to investigate, but they needed someone who could translate between the military pilots and the civilian authorities on the ground. Phillips added that whatever was up in space had just disabled 3 communication satellites and knocked out half of NORAD's computer systems. The commercial radio frequency they were using was one of the few communication channels still working in this airspace. Kate was not being asked to fly anything, but instead to act as a bridge between the fighter pilots, who were engaging with this unknown object, and the people on the ground who were trying to coordinate a response. Kate sat down in the jump seat behind the 2 pilots and took the headset that Harris handed to her. She adjusted the microphone and asked them to patch her through to the military channel. Static filled her ears for a moment, and then she heard a young man's voice speaking rapidly and breathing hard. The voice identified itself as Razor 1 and said they had visual contact with the bogey. The pilot said it was not like anything they had been briefed about, and it did not match any known aircraft profile from any country on Earth. Kate pressed the microphone button and identified herself as Morrison and said she was former Valiant Air Wing. There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice asked if this was Kate Morrison. She confirmed, and the voice on the other end suddenly sounded almost happy. The pilot said his name was Danny Price, and they had flown together during training at Fallon years ago. Kate remembered him as talented and confident, and sometimes too cocky for his own good, but he had been one of the best pilots in their class. Danny's voice became serious again as he gave her a situation report. He said they had a contact at 70,000 feet and it was descending. The shape was wrong and the geometry did not make sense. There were no wings and no visible engines, but it was moving through the air like nothing he had ever seen before. He said the object had just pulled a 40G turn without slowing down at all. Kate felt cold fear run through her body because no human pilot could survive those forces, and no human aircraft could generate that kind of acceleration without tearing itself apart. She asked Danny what his rules of engagement were, and he said they were on weapons hold unless the object showed hostile intent. The problem was that nobody knew what hostile intent would look like from something that was not human. Kate asked if there was only one object, and Danny said there were 3 confirmed and possibly 5 total. They were staying in formation and descending over the Pacific Ocean. Their current trajectory would put them over Los Angeles in 20 minutes. Kate looked at Captain Phillips and saw that his face had gone pale. Their commercial flight was heading straight toward Los Angeles and would be in the same airspace as these unknown objects. She asked Danny how much time they had to divert civilian traffic, and he replied that there was not enough time. The objects were accelerating and moving faster than anything he had ever tracked before. Kate's mind raced through every combat scenario she had ever trained for, but none of them had prepared her for this situation. The cockpit had transformed into a makeshift command center within minutes, and Kate found herself coordinating between multiple groups, while Captain Phillips worked the commercial radio to divert air traffic. Harris monitored their instruments and watched for any sign of the approaching craft on their radar screens. Kate kept her headset on and maintained constant contact with the fighter squadron, while trying to build a mental picture of what they were actually facing up there in the sky. She asked Danny to describe the formation pattern the objects were flying in, and her mind was already running through every combat scenario she had ever studied. Danny said they were flying in a diamond spread with about 2 miles of separation between each craft. The lead object was larger than the others and maybe twice their size. He said there was no radar signature unless the objects wanted to be seen, and that they seemed to be playing games with the fighter pilots. They would let the jets get close and then suddenly vanish from all sensors before reappearing somewhere else entirely. Kate asked about weapon systems, and Danny said there were no visible weapons on any of the craft, but something strange had just happened to Razor 4. The lead ship had done something to his electronics, and his entire instrument panel had lit up like a Christmas tree before going completely dark for 15 seconds. The pilot was okay now, but his targeting system was displaying random numbers and symbols that made no sense. Kate felt her training kick in as she processed this information and realized these objects had technology far beyond anything humans had developed. Through the cockpit windows, she suddenly saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. A streak of light was descending through the cloud layer and moving impossibly fast, but somehow in a controlled and purposeful way. It was not falling like a meteor or a piece of space debris. It was landing with intention and intelligence behind its movements. Kate grabbed the microphone and told all Razor elements not to engage unless they were fired upon first. She repeated the order about weapons hold and emphasized that they needed to maintain discipline. Danny's voice came back immediately, saying the objects were entering civilian airspace and asking if she was sure about the no-fire order. Kate said she was absolutely sure, because if these things wanted to hurt humans, they would already be dead. The maneuvers Danny had described meant these craft could have turned every fighter jet into scrap metal within seconds. The fact that they had not done so meant they were being careful and possibly even trying not to cause harm. She told Danny that his electronics being scrambled and then restored proved they had incredible power, but were choosing not to use it destructively. A new voice cut into the channel, and it was harder and older than Danny's young voice. The man identified himself as General Vance from Air Combat Command and asked Kate by what authority she was giving orders to his pilots. Kate kept her voice level and professional as she explained that she was the only person currently talking to both the fighter pilots and civilian air traffic control. She said that unless the general wanted 300 commercial flights scattered across the Pacific with no coordination, then they needed to work together on this situation. There was a long pause where Kate could hear static and distant voices conferring on the other end. Then General Vance came back and told her to continue her current actions. He told the Razor elements to follow her guidance for civilian coordination, but added that if the craft entered Los Angeles airspace, his pilots would engage with full weapons. Kate understood the position the general was in, but she also knew that attacking these objects would be useless and would probably just make everything worse. Captain Phillips tapped her shoulder and pointed to his radio equipment. He said someone was overriding their frequency and broadcasting directly to their aircraft. A new voice came through the speakers, and it was female and calm and identified itself as Lieutenant Sophie Grant from the United States Air Force. The woman said they needed Kate Morrison on the ground immediately and that their flight was cleared for emergency landing at Edwards Air Force Base. She said to follow the vector they were transmitting and that everything was arranged. Kate looked at Phillips and he nodded with a grim expression on his face. He told her that her country needed her more than the passengers did, and that he and Harris would get everyone safely on the ground. Kate unbuckled from the jump seat and thanked both pilots before heading back into the cabin. The passengers all stared at her as she walked past, and she could see fear and confusion on their faces. A small child asked his mother why the lady was leaving, and the mother just shushed him quietly. 10 minutes later, Kate was running across the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base, still wearing her civilian clothes and heading toward a waiting helicopter that had its rotors already spinning. A tall woman in a flight suit met her at the door and asked if she was Commander Morrison. Kate confirmed, and the woman said she was Lieutenant Grant and told Kate to strap in immediately. She said the Secretary of Defense wanted Kate at the landing site as fast as possible. The helicopter lifted off, and Kate looked out the window at the fighter jets streaking overhead in formation. They were maintaining their patrol pattern and staying alert for any threats. Below them, the desert stretched out in all directions, looking empty and peaceful. In the distance, Kate could see 3 shapes resting on the sand that should not exist according to everything humans knew about physics and engineering. The shapes were too smooth and too perfect and seemed to bend light in ways that hurt her eyes when she tried to focus on them. Grant handed her a tablet computer and told her to read the briefing document during the flight. Kate scrolled through page after page of technical data and eyewitness reports and grainy photographs taken from fighter jet cameras. Nothing in the document made sense because the objects seemed to violate every law of physics. They had no visible engines but could accelerate to incredible speeds. They had no wings but could maneuver in atmosphere as easily as in space. Their hulls showed no seams or rivets or any sign of how they had been constructed. The helicopter began its descent, and Kate could see the military perimeter that had been established around the landing site, with hundreds of vehicles and thousands of personnel. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust, and Kate jumped out before the rotors had fully stopped spinning. Lieutenant Grant led her across the sand toward a cluster of command trailers and mobile operations centers that had been set up in a rough circle around the landing site. Soldiers and airmen moved with purpose between the vehicles, and Kate could see weapons being positioned and surveillance equipment being deployed. The entire operation had the feeling of controlled chaos as everyone worked to establish some kind of protocol for a situation that had never occurred before in human history. A woman in a general's uniform approached them with quick steps and sharp eyes that took in everything about Kate in a single glance. She introduced herself as General Patricia Hayes and said Kate was needed because she was the first military contact the objects had acknowledged. Kate stopped walking and asked what the general meant by acknowledged. Hayes explained that when they had demanded Kate be brought to the site, the objects had responded to that demand. Kate felt confusion wash over her because she had just been coordinating radio traffic and talking to Danny. She asked how the objects had responded, and Hayes gestured for her to follow. They entered a command trailer filled with computer screens and communication equipment, and people working frantically at various stations. One large screen on the wall showed different camera angles of the 3 craft sitting motionless on the desert sand. Another screen displayed a simple text message in perfect English that made Kate's blood run cold. The message said they would speak with Kate Morrison because she had shown wisdom and asked that she be brought to them. The words were in a standard font like someone had typed them on a computer, but nobody knew how the message had been transmitted or received. Kate asked how they knew her name, and a young man in civilian clothes looked up from his laptop. He had messy hair and glasses and the exhausted look of someone who had been working without sleep for many hours. He explained that the objects had been listening to every radio transmission and every frequency that humans use to communicate. They had been parsing human language and learning names and understanding social structures. He said the objects knew more about humans than humans knew about them, and that was a terrifying thought. General Hayes asked if anyone had tried to approach the craft yet, and Hayes nodded. She said they had sent a small drone to investigate, but it had gotten within 50 meters before something shut it down completely. The drone had not been destroyed or damaged, but simply stopped working like someone had flipped a power switch. When they tried to send personnel on foot, the objects had projected a message into the sand using some kind of directed energy beam. The message had told them to wait for Kate Morrison to arrive. Kate walked to the window and looked out at the 3 ships sitting quietly on the desert floor. Up close, they were even more impossible than they had appeared from the helicopter. The surfaces seemed to shift and change in the sunlight, showing depths and dimensions that could not exist in normal 3-dimensional space. There were no seams or windows or hatches or any visible way to enter or exit the craft. The hulls were smooth and flowing with curves that hurt to look at for too long, because her brain kept trying to make sense of geometry that did not follow normal rules. She turned back to General Hayes and asked what they needed her to do. Hayes said simply that Kate needed to talk to whoever or whatever was inside those ships and find out what they wanted. Kate felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders, and she thought about all the pilots and soldiers and civilians who were depending on her to handle this correctly. She thought about the passengers on that commercial flight who were probably landing safely right now, because she had helped coordinate their diversion. She thought about humanity standing at a crossroads and not knowing which direction to turn. Hayes handed her a small radio device and told her it would maintain contact with the command center as she approached. Kate clipped it to her belt and checked that it was working properly. A technician gave her a small camera that would transmit video back to the command trailer, so everyone could see what she saw. Kate put on the camera and felt like she was preparing for a mission, but this was unlike any mission she had ever trained for. Nobody had a protocol for first contact with an alien species. Nobody knew what to say or how to act or what the consequences might be. She walked out of the trailer and across the perimeter that had been established by the military. Soldiers watched her go with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. Some of them were young enough to be her students if she had been teaching instead of flying. Some of them had families waiting at home who did not know yet that the world had just changed forever. Kate walked steadily across the sand, feeling the heat of the desert sun on her face and the weight of human history on her back. At 50 meters from the nearest craft, she stopped and stood still. She took a deep breath and spoke clearly, knowing that her words were being recorded and transmitted and would probably be analyzed for centuries to come. She said she was Kate Morrison and that they had asked for her and that she was here now. Her voice sounded small in the vast emptiness of the desert, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The ship sat silent and motionless, and Kate wondered if she had misunderstood or if the message had been a mistake. Then a section of the nearest ship simply was not there anymore. Kate blinked and tried to understand what she had just seen, but her brain could not process it. The hull had not opened like a door and had not slid aside like a panel. A piece of the ship had simply stopped existing, and in its place was a gentle ramp leading up into a softly lit interior. Kate's training told her to be cautious and to wait for backup, and to establish clear communication before proceeding. Her instincts told her something different. These beings had crossed distances that humans could barely imagine, and had technology that made human science look like primitive cave paintings. If they wanted to hurt her or capture her or kill her, then she would never see it coming and there would be nothing she could do to prevent it. The fact that they had asked for her specifically and had waited patiently meant they wanted communication, not confrontation. Kate made a decision and started walking up the ramp. Inside the ship, Kate found herself in a space that should not have been possible, based on the external dimensions she had seen. The interior was vast and stretched out in directions that made her dizzy when she tried to follow the walls with her eyes. The surfaces glowed with a gentle light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The air smelled clean with a hint of ozone, and something else she could not identify but which reminded her somehow of thunderstorms and electricity. She took slow steps forward and felt the floor beneath her boots, which seemed solid enough but also seemed to adjust slightly to her weight with each step. 3 figures stood in the center of the space, and Kate felt her heart rate increase as she approached them. They were roughly her height, which surprised her because she had expected something either much larger or much smaller. Their bodies were humanoid with 2 arms and 2 legs and a central torso, but that was where the similarities to humans ended completely. Their skin was a deep blue-gray color that looked almost like polished stone and seemed to shimmer slightly in the ambient light. They had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on faces that were too symmetrical and too perfect to be natural. Their movements were fluid and graceful in a way that reminded Kate of water flowing around obstacles. The central figure stepped forward, and Kate noticed it was slightly taller than the other 2. She waited and kept her hands visible and tried to appear calm, even though her mind was racing. The being opened what might have been a mouth, but no sound came from it. Instead, Kate heard words forming in the air around her, as if the ship itself was translating thoughts into English. The voice was neutral and clear and somehow seemed to come from inside her own head. The being said her name and told her that she had prevented conflict when fear would have caused it. It said she had protected the vulnerable while coordinating with warriors, and that she embodied what they had come to find. Kate forced herself to remain still and professional, even though every instinct was screaming that this situation was beyond anything she understood. She asked what they had come to find. The being made a gesture with one hand that might have been an invitation to follow, and started walking toward one side of the chamber. Kate followed, and the other two beings fell into step behind her. She noticed their feet made no sound on the floor, and their movements were perfectly synchronized in a way that suggested either long practice or some kind of shared awareness. They walked through corridors that curved and bent in ways that defied normal geometry. Kate passed openings that showed other chambers filled with equipment she could not begin to understand. Some rooms contained what looked like growing things with colors she had never seen before. Other rooms held devices that hummed with power and seemed to fold space around themselves. The being led her to a large chamber with a viewing screen that showed Earth floating in space. The planet looked so beautiful and fragile from this perspective, and Kate felt a sudden protective surge of emotion. The being introduced itself as Krell and explained that its people had been watching humanity for 3 generations. They had watched humans split the atom and reach for the stars and create beautiful art and terrible weapons. They had watched humans build great cities and burn forests and save endangered species and wage wars over resources. For decades, their council had debated whether humanity was ready for what they wanted to offer. Kate listened carefully and tried to absorb the magnitude of what Krell was telling her. She asked what humans needed to be ready for, and Krell turned all 4 eyes toward her with an intensity that was almost physical. Krell said they wanted to know if humans were ready to learn they were not alone in the universe. They wanted to know if humans were ready to join a network of civilized worlds that stretched across the galaxy. They wanted to know if humans were ready to take their place among the stars and accept the responsibilities that came with that knowledge. Krell said that readiness was not measured in technology or military power, but in wisdom and compassion, and the ability to think beyond immediate self-interest. Kate asked if this entire event had been a test, and Krell made a sound that the translation system rendered as affirmation. Krell explained that everything was always a test because actions revealed truth more clearly than words ever could. They had disabled human weapon systems and entered the atmosphere without warning because they wanted to see how humans would respond to the unknown. They had positioned their ships to appear threatening because they wanted to see if humans would attack first and ask questions later, or if humans would show restraint and wisdom. Krell said they could have destroyed every major city on Earth within minutes if that had been their intention. Instead, they had waited and watched and listened to the radio transmissions. They had heard Kate coordinating with the fighter pilots and protecting civilian flights while gathering information. They had heard her tell Danny not to fire unless fired upon. They had seen her balance caution with curiosity and protect the weak while respecting the strong. Krell said that Kate's actions had shown the kind of wisdom they were looking for. Kate felt uncomfortable with the praise because she had just been doing her job and following her training. She said that one person's actions could not represent an entire species, and that humans were capable of both great wisdom and terrible foolishness. Krell agreed and said that was exactly why they needed to conduct more observations. They needed to see if Kate's wisdom was an individual trait or a cultural value that could be taught and spread and grown. Krell said they needed to understand if humanity as a whole was ready, or if only certain individuals had evolved beyond violence and fear. The ship suddenly trembled in a way that Kate could feel through the floor, and she realized they were moving. She looked at the viewing screen and saw the other 2 ships rising from the desert and forming up in that same diamond pattern she had seen earlier. Krell gestured to the screen and explained they were moving into position over major population centers. Kate asked where they were going and what they were planning to do. Krell said they were going to address the people of Earth directly and offer a choice that would define humanity for generations. Kate felt anxiety building in her chest because she did not know what choice Krell was talking about or what the consequences might be. The ships moved into position over cities that represented every continent and every major culture on Earth. Kate watched the viewing screen as one ship positioned itself over New York while others moved to hover above London and Beijing and Moscow and Mumbai and São Paulo. The precision of their movements was stunning as they maintained perfect formation while traveling at speeds that would have torn human aircraft apart. Krell explained that they were about to broadcast on every frequency and every screen and every device, capable of receiving a signal across the entire planet. Kate realized that billions of people were about to receive humanity's first message from an alien species. Krell stood before what looked like a control panel that responded to gestures and thoughts rather than physical touch. The other 2 beings moved to stations around the chamber, and Kate understood they were preparing for something significant. Krell turned to face the viewing screen and began speaking. The words that came out were in the alien language, but Kate heard the English translation forming in her mind simultaneously. She listened as Krell introduced their people as the Collective and explained they represented a union of 47 worlds dedicated to peace and knowledge and mutual advancement. Krell said they had traveled far to extend an invitation to humanity. Kate watched the screen split into multiple views, showing crowds gathering in streets around the world. People were stopping in their tracks and looking up at the ships hovering silently above their cities. Kate saw faces filled with fear and wonder and confusion and hope. She saw families holding each other, and soldiers raising weapons and religious leaders falling to their knees. She saw humanity in all its diversity reacting to a moment that would be remembered forever. Krell continued speaking and explained that human species stood at a threshold. Humans had developed technology that could either destroy their world or carry them to the stars. Humans had demonstrated capacity for both violence and compassion in their history. Krell said that today the Collective was offering humanity a choice that would determine their future path. Kate felt the weight of those words and understood that every person on Earth was hearing this same message, in their own language translated by technology that humans could not comprehend. The choice Krell presented was simple in words but staggering in implications. Humans could choose to join the Collective and receive knowledge that would transform their civilization. They would be given medicine that could cure diseases that currently killed millions. They would receive energy technology that required no fuel and produced no pollution. They would learn how to feed every person and shelter every family, and restore damaged ecosystems. The Collective would share everything they had learned across thousands of years of development and exploration. Kate listened as Krell explained the price of this gift. Humans would have to commit to peace and end all wars. They would have to dismantle weapons of mass destruction and agree to settle disputes through negotiation rather than violence. They would still govern themselves and maintain their cultures and religions and political systems, but they would do so as members of a greater community. They would be bound by laws that protected all sentient life and prohibited conquest and exploitation. They would have to grow beyond their violent history and embrace cooperation over competition. Krell paused to let the magnitude of the offer sink in before presenting the alternative. Humans could refuse the invitation and the Collective would leave them in peace. There would be no punishment or retaliation or judgment. The ships would simply depart and humanity would continue on its current path without interference. But Krell was clear that this opportunity came only once in a civilization's development. If humans chose isolation now, it would be centuries before the Collective returned to check on their progress. The decision to accept or reject had to be unanimous among global leaders, and had to be made freely with full understanding of what was being accepted or rejected. Krell said the Collective would return in 30 Earth days for humanity's answer. The ships would remain in orbit during that time, as a reminder that the offer was real and the choice was genuine. Krell encouraged humans to debate and discuss and carefully consider what they wanted for their future. The transmission ended and Kate saw on the screen that people around the world were reacting in every possible way. Some were celebrating in the streets and declaring this a new age for humanity. Others were protesting and claiming the aliens were demons or conquerors in disguise. Some were organizing prayer vigils while others were demanding immediate military action. Kate heard her radio crackling with General Hayes demanding to know her status and asking what was happening. Kate told the general she was safe and would explain everything, but right now she needed to understand more about what had just been offered. Krell turned away from the viewing screen and those four eyes focused on Kate with what might have been curiosity. Krell asked what Kate thought her people would choose, and Kate realized she had no simple answer to that question. She thought about the passengers on that airplane who had trusted her to coordinate their safety. She thought about Danny and the other fighter pilots who had held their fire when every instinct told them to shoot. She thought about Captain Phillips landing his plane smoothly despite the crisis unfolding around him. She thought about all the small acts of wisdom and restraint she had witnessed in just a few hours. But she also thought about human history, filled with wars and hatred and the stubborn refusal to cooperate, even when cooperation was clearly in everyone's best interest. Kate told Krell honestly that she did not know what humanity would choose. She said humans were capable of surprising acts of both brilliance and stupidity. She said they could be wise and foolish in the same moment. She said they could recognize the right path and still choose to walk in the wrong direction, because of fear or pride or simple short-sightedness. Krell listened without interrupting, and Kate appreciated that the being was not trying to influence her response or tell her what answer was correct. Finally, Kate said she thought humanity would surprise Krell one way or another. She said that was what humans did best because they were unpredictable and stubborn and creative in ways that often defied logic. Krell made that sound again that indicated approval or agreement. Krell said that unpredictability and creativity were exactly what the collective valued because those traits indicated a species that could grow and adapt and contribute new perspectives to the greater community. Kate asked what would happen if humanity chose to refuse the offer. Krell explained that the collective would honor that choice completely and depart without interference. Earth would be marked as a developing civilization that preferred isolation, and the collective would not return for many generations. Kate spent hours inside the ship asking questions and learning about the collective, while Earth descended into organized chaos below. Krell showed her images of other worlds that had joined the network, and explained how each civilization had faced similar choices. Some had accepted immediately, while others had debated for their equivalent of years before reaching consensus. A few had refused and been left alone to develop at their own pace. Krell said there was no shame in either choice because wisdom meant knowing your own limitations and understanding when you were truly ready for change. The viewing screen displayed news feeds from around the world, and Kate watched as world leaders made emergency broadcasts. The President of the United States appeared at a podium looking tired and serious and called for calm and careful deliberation. The Secretary General of the United Nations convened an emergency session, and representatives from every nation began arriving in New York. Religious leaders offered interpretations ranging from divine blessing to apocalyptic warning. Scientists formed committees to analyze the technological claims Krell had made. Military officials debated whether the offer was genuine or a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. Kate saw protests forming in cities where some people demanded immediate acceptance, while others insisted the offer was a trap. She saw financial markets crash as investors panicked about an uncertain future. She saw people hoarding supplies and others donating everything they owned to charity. She saw humanity at its worst and its best simultaneously. Krell watched the feeds with those 4 eyes that never seemed to blink, and Kate wondered what the being was thinking. She asked Krell why the collective had not simply made humanity better through technology, or genetic modification, or some other means. Krell explained that forced change never lasted, because it lacked the foundation of choice and commitment. The collective had learned through long experience that civilizations needed to choose their own path to wisdom. A species that was pushed toward peace would eventually rebel, while a species that chose peace willingly would defend that choice with determination. Krell said the 30-day waiting period was not arbitrary, but carefully calculated to give humans enough time to seriously consider the implications without allowing fear to completely paralyze decision-making. Kate's radio had been buzzing constantly with messages from General Hayes and other officials demanding her return. She told Krell she needed to go back and help her people understand what was being offered. Krell agreed and said Kate would be a valuable bridge between the two species during the coming days. The being walked Kate back through the corridors to the exit ramp and told her the ship would be accessible if she needed to return. Kate stepped onto the ramp and descended back into the desert heat where she could see military vehicles waiting at the perimeter. General Hayes met her with barely contained frustration mixed with relief. The general demanded a full debriefing immediately, and Kate agreed but said she needed food and water first because she had not eaten since before boarding the airplane that morning. Hayes ordered someone to bring rations and bottles of water, and Kate sat in the command trailer eating protein bars while trying to explain what she had learned. Military analysts and civilian scientists crowded into the small space asking questions faster than Kate could answer them. She explained that the collective was offering genuine help, but required genuine commitment to peace in return. She described the technology she had seen, and admitted she barely understood a fraction of it. She told them Krell seemed honest and straightforward, but also made clear that the choice had to be unanimous among world leaders. If even one major nation refused, then the entire offer would be withdrawn because the collective would not create division or conflict among humans. Several analysts immediately started calculating political scenarios and trying to predict which nations might refuse. Kate was driven to Edwards Air Force Base where a private jet waited to take her to Washington. During the flight she tried to sleep, but her mind kept replaying everything she had seen and heard. She thought about the passengers on her original flight, who had been terrified when the captain made his announcement. She wondered if those people were celebrating now or hiding in fear. She thought about Danny still flying patrol missions around the ships and wondered if he understood how close he had come to starting an interstellar war by accident. The plane landed at a military airfield outside Washington, and Kate was taken directly to the Pentagon. She found herself in a secure briefing room facing the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and several people in civilian clothes who were introduced simply as advisors. Kate spent 6 hours answering questions and describing everything she had observed. The Secretary of Defense was particularly concerned about the requirement to dismantle weapons of mass destruction and asked if there was any room for negotiation on that point. Kate said that Krell had been clear the terms were not negotiable because the collective would not accept a member species that maintained the capability to destroy entire planets. She explained that from the collective's perspective, humans keeping nuclear weapons would be like inviting someone into your house who insisted on carrying a loaded gun at all times. The advisors argued that dismantling weapons would leave Earth vulnerable to attack from hostile species, but Kate pointed out that any species capable of interstellar travel would view human weapons as primitive toys. The collective's protection would be far more valuable than any weapons humans currently possessed. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs asked what military role humans would play in the collective, and Kate admitted she had not thought to ask that question. The Secretary of Defense said that would need to be clarified before any decision could be made because no nation would agree to completely abandon defensive capabilities. Kate agreed to ask Krell when she returned to the landing site. The meeting finally ended near midnight, and Kate was taken to temporary quarters in a building normally reserved for visiting foreign officers. She showered and changed into clean clothes that had been provided and tried to sleep, but her mind would not stop racing. She thought about the choice facing humanity and realized how genuinely difficult it was. Kate returned to the desert landing site 3 days later with a list of questions from world leaders and military officials and scientific organizations. The ship still sat motionless on the sand, and Krell greeted her like an expected visitor. Kate asked about military roles within the collective, and Krell explained that member species maintained defensive forces, but focused on protection rather than conquest. The collective had enemies in the galaxy, including hostile species that rejected cooperation, and some ancient artificial intelligences that viewed biological life as inefficient. Member worlds contributed ships and personnel to a combined fleet that patrolled and protected the network, but never initiated aggression. Krell said humans would actually be valuable to the collective military, because human tactical thinking was unusual compared to most species. Most aliens approached conflict through logical analysis and mathematical optimization, but humans used intuition and creativity and sometimes made decisions that seemed irrational but proved effective. Krell said human pilots in particular had impressed them with the ability to adapt quickly to unexpected situations. The collective would train human forces in advanced technology while learning from human tactical approaches. Kate asked about governance and whether the collective would interfere with human political systems. Krell explained that each member world maintained complete internal autonomy, and humans would still have nations and elections and different forms of government. The collective only enforced a few basic laws that protected sentient rights and prevented warfare and environmental destruction. Beyond those fundamentals, humans would be free to organize themselves however they chose. Krell said diversity of thought and culture was considered valuable because it led to innovation and prevented stagnation. She asked what would happen to human criminals and whether the collective had prisons. Krell said most member species had moved beyond punishment-based justice and focused instead on rehabilitation and restitution. Crime rates were extremely low in the collective because poverty and desperation had been eliminated through technology and cooperation. The few individuals who still committed harmful acts were usually suffering from medical conditions that could be treated. Kate thought about Earth's overcrowded prisons and wondered how human society would change if people's basic needs were genuinely met. Kate returned to Washington with answers, but also with more questions. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meetings and briefings and negotiations. The United Nations held sessions that ran around the clock as representatives debated every aspect of the offer. Kate testified before Congress and Parliament and several other governmental bodies. She appeared on news programs and tried to explain what she had seen in ways that ordinary people could understand. She received death threats from people who thought she was a traitor and marriage proposals from people who thought she was a hero. Scientists had limited access to one of the ships and returned with reports that confirmed everything Krell had claimed. The technology was real and functional and far beyond current human capabilities. Medical researchers were particularly excited about healing devices that could repair damaged tissue at the cellular level. Energy specialists analyzed power systems that drew energy from quantum vacuum fluctuations. Agricultural experts studied food production methods that could feed billions without depleting soil or requiring pesticides. But the political debates were vicious and bitter. Some nations argued that accepting the offer meant surrendering sovereignty and becoming subordinate to alien rule. Others countered that refusing the offer meant condemning billions of people to preventable suffering and death. Religious groups split, with some declaring the collective to be angels while others called them demons. Economic experts debated whether human economies could survive the transition to post-scarcity systems. Military leaders worried about becoming dependent on alien protection. Kate watched from inside the whirlwind and felt increasingly frustrated with the endless arguments. She understood that the decision was complex and consequential, but she also saw people dying from diseases that could be cured, and children starving when food technology existed to feed everyone. She saw glaciers melting and forests burning while clean energy solutions waited. She felt humanity's stubborn pride and fear preventing progress toward a better future. On day 20 of the 30-day deadline, the United Nations vote was scheduled. Kate sat in the gallery and watched as representatives from 193 nations cast their votes. The measure required unanimous acceptance to pass. Kate felt tension building as each vote was recorded. Most nations voted yes with passionate speeches about hope and progress. A handful voted no, citing concerns about sovereignty and security. Several nations abstained, saying they needed more time to study the implications. The vote failed to achieve unanimity. Kate felt something break inside her chest as she realized humanity was going to reject the offer, because a few nations could not overcome their fear and pride. The collective had been clear that partial acceptance was not acceptable because it would create division and conflict. Either all of humanity joined together or none of them could join at all. Kate left the United Nations building and walked through New York streets filled with protesters on both sides of the issue. She returned to the desert and climbed aboard Krell's ship to deliver the news. Krell listened without visible reaction as Kate explained the vote results. Kate expected disappointment or anger, but Krell simply said the outcome was not surprising. Many species failed to achieve consensus on their first opportunity. Krell said the collective would honor humanity's choice and depart as promised. Kate asked when they would return, and Krell said probably in 3 or 4 human generations after humanity had more time to mature and develop. Kate felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized what was being lost. She asked if there was any way to change the outcome or get another chance. Krell said the 30-day period had been chosen carefully, and extending it would not help, because the nations that voted no were not going to change their positions based on more time. Fear and pride were not rational and could not be reasoned away. Krell said humanity needed to learn some lessons the hard way before they would be ready to accept help. She asked what would happen to Earth over the next few generations without the collective's help. Krell said honestly that some humans would thrive while others would suffer. Technology would advance slowly and some problems would be solved while others grew worse. There would be more wars and more environmental damage before humans finally exhausted themselves and realized cooperation was the only path forward. Kate left the ship feeling defeated and walked back across the desert sand toward the military perimeter. The sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost mocking in their beauty. She thought about all the people who would die from preventable diseases, and all the children who would go hungry, and all the environmental destruction that would continue. She thought about the opportunity that had been lost because some world leaders valued pride over progress. She felt angry and sad and helpless all at the same time. General Hayes met her at the perimeter and asked what Krell had said. Kate reported that the collective would be leaving soon and would not return for several generations. Hayes looked tired and older than she had appeared a month ago. The general said she had voted in favor of acceptance if anyone cared, but her vote had not been the one that mattered. Kate appreciated the sentiment, but it did not change the outcome. They stood together watching the ships as darkness fell and stars began appearing in the desert sky. Kate returned to Washington to find the city divided between celebration and mourning. Those who had opposed acceptance were declaring victory, and claiming they had saved humanity from subjugation. Those who had supported acceptance were organizing protests and demanding the vote be held again. Kate ignored both groups and focused on writing her official report for the military. She described everything she had observed and learned with clinical precision, and tried to keep emotion out of her words. Her commanding officer read the report and told her she had done everything correctly and should be proud of her service. She did not feel proud. She felt like she had been given a chance to help humanity take a giant leap forward and had watched that chance slip away. She requested leave and flew back to Hawaii, where she was still officially stationed. She went to the beach and sat in the sand and watched waves rolling in from the Pacific. She thought about Krell and the other 47 civilized worlds working together across the galaxy. She thought about what humanity could have become if fear had not won over hope. On day 30, the ships departed. Kate was in her quarters when it happened, but she heard about it from others. The ships had simply risen into the sky and accelerated until they were invisible. There had been no farewell message and no final warning. They had honored their promise to leave humanity alone, and they had done exactly that. Kate felt a sense of finality that was almost physical. She knew she would never see Krell again, and never get to learn about those other civilizations. She knew humanity had made its choice and would have to live with the consequences. Days turned into weeks and life slowly returned to normal. The media coverage decreased and people stopped arguing about the collective. Politicians moved on to other issues and scientists returned to their regular research. Kate went back to flying training missions and tried to focus on her duties. But something had changed inside her that she could not quite define. She had seen the stars and met beings from another world, and understood how small and petty human conflicts appeared from that perspective. She started writing letters to world leaders and scientists and journalists. She described what she had learned from Krell and argued that humanity needed to prepare for the next opportunity. She said humans needed to work toward peace and cooperation, not because aliens demanded it, but because it was the right path forward. She said technology meant nothing without wisdom, and weapons meant nothing without compassion. Most of her letters went unanswered, but a few people responded with interest and encouragement. Kate received orders transferring her to a new position at the Pentagon, working on long-range strategic planning. Her commanding officer said her experience with the collective made her valuable for thinking about humanity's future. Kate accepted the assignment and moved to Washington permanently. She found herself working with other people who had been changed by the encounter. Danny had left active flight status and was now teaching at the academy, with a focus on teaching restraint and judgment alongside flying skills. Lieutenant Grant had become an advocate for international cooperation within the military. Together they formed an informal network of people who believed humanity could do better. They organized conferences and published papers and slowly built a movement focused on preparing for the next chance. They called it the Readiness Initiative, and its goal was simple but ambitious. They wanted to create a culture where peace and cooperation were valued over conflict and competition. They wanted to prove that humans could achieve wisdom without being forced into it by circumstances or aliens. Kate knew the work would take generations and might ultimately fail. The nations that had voted against acceptance were not suddenly going to change their fundamental values. Human nature was not going to evolve overnight, but she also remembered what she had told Krell about humans being unpredictable and creative, and capable of surprising acts. She remembered the fighter pilots holding their fire, and the commercial airline captain landing safely, and all the small acts of wisdom she had witnessed during those chaotic days. 5 years passed and Kate was promoted to commander. 10 years passed and she made captain. She continued working on the Readiness Initiative and watched it grow from a small group of idealists into a genuine movement, with support from governments and organizations around the world. Wars still happened and people still suffered, but slowly things were improving. Environmental treaties were signed and weapons were reduced and cooperation increased. It was not enough and it was not fast enough, but it was progress. Kate thought about Krell often and wondered if the collective was watching from somewhere out among the stars. She wondered if they could see the changes happening on Earth and if they approved. She wondered if humanity would be ready when they returned in 3 or 4 generations. She would not live to see that day, but maybe her children or grandchildren would. Maybe they would get to make the choice that her generation had failed to make. She sat at her desk in the Pentagon looking at satellite images of Earth. The planet still had problems, but it also had hope. Humans were still foolish and stubborn, but they were also capable of learning and growing. Kate opened a new document and began writing another letter to world leaders. She described the choice that was coming and argued that humanity needed to be ready. She said the stars were waiting and opportunity would return. She said humans had surprised themselves before and could do it again. She signed her name and sent the letter knowing it would probably be ignored, but sending it anyway because hope required action, not just wishes. Kate Morrison had been sleeping on an airplane when the world changed forever, and now she spent her days trying to make sure humanity was ready when the world changed again.